Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. Very warm Melbourne evening, I should add. It's a great pleasure to be addressing the Victorian branch of the AIIA. I've never spoken to the Victorian branch before. I think I've done Brisbane, Sydney, so I'm slowly adding to my list, working my way around the country. I'd especially like to thank Les, the president of AIIA Victoria, who, as he mentioned, is an old DFAT colleague. As Les indicated, every 20 years or so he makes a spectacular lapse of judgment, as he did in 1991 when he recruited me to DFAT. But I'm certainly grateful for it. I'm not sure what DFAT was. Tonight my job is to peer a little into the future, to examine what Afghanistan, and more importantly, the region that Afghanistan sits in, will look like once NATO withdraws at the end of 2014. Now, one of the dangers of looking into the future is that you'll get it wrong, but one of the advantages of looking into the future is that if you look into the reasonably distant future, and 2014 is still reasonably distant, no one will remember that you got it wrong. So here's hoping that you'll all forget pretty much next week what I'm about to tell you this evening. The way I want to structure my talk this evening is to talk about some of the three factors that I think that will shape what the regional situation will look like post 2014 and towards 2015. Those three factors are fairly obvious ones. The first is clearly the shape of the international community, particularly NATO's engagement with Afghanistan going towards 2014 and beyond. And here I'm not just talking about the military withdrawal, but also the shape of international engagement in terms of the international community's economic and development engagement with Afghanistan, but also its political engagement with the country. Second, we also need to understand the domestic political context in Afghanistan and how this will evolve out to 2014. I won't spend a lot of time on this, mainly because I'm not an expert on it, but there's a couple of salient points that I'll make. And thirdly, we have to understand some of the regional and international relationships around Afghanistan. That will tell us also a lot about what Afghanistan and its region will look like in 2015. But let's start with the international engagement. There are three elements here: military, developmental, economic, and political. When you talk about military engagement and NATO, and I'll mainly focus on the US because its military engagement with Afghanistan is the most important and more or less sets the parameters for everyone else's, you literally are talking about the shape of the US's engagement in Afghanistan. In 2009, President Obama announced that US forces would begin to draw down in Afghanistan from 2011, more or less independently of what was happening in the country. Individual NATO, ISAF, and ISAF forces, including Australia, also announced that their own intentions to draw down. As I said, I'll focus mainly on the US because it's the most important player. There are broadly two elements to the US military drawdown in Afghanistan. Firstly, from a peak strength of about 100,000 troops in 2011, US forces have now fallen to about 68,000 this year. And they'll continue to decline until the end of 2014, when the vast majority of troops will be gone. There will be some troops remaining. No one is quite sure how many, doing counter-terrorism operations, but also some ongoing training of Afghan forces. And the second element to the US drawdown is a transition to Afghan forces taking the lead in combat operations against insurgency. This has already been happening and it will culminate in mid-2013 when Afghan security forces will have the lead across the entire country, and remaining US and ISAF forces will transition to support rather than a combat role. Now, what's less clear, and what is clearly being debated in Washington at the moment, is the shape of the remaining of the withdrawal from now until the end of 2014. And when I say shape, I literally do mean shape. There are three possibilities here. One is that you have a straight line withdrawal In other words, a steady withdrawal from now until 2014. The other possibility is that you have a concave line. In other words, an accelerated withdrawal in the early part of 2013 or from now, where the bulk of the forces leave early, leaving fewer into 2014, or where the shape of the withdrawal, where the line is a convex line, where the withdrawal in some senses is decelerated, where the bulk of troops leave a lot closer to the end point in 2014. Now, Obama's originally talked about a straight line, a steady withdrawal from this year to 2014. It's clear, however, that his generals are pushing for something that looks more like a concave line. And this is important for three reasons. First, the military want to keep, the US military want to keep the bulk of troops in Afghanistan through another fighting season in 2013. That's why they want to continue to draw down, but not draw down so quickly next year, and accelerate the drawdown in 2014. This gives them another good go at degrading Taliban and other insurgent groups on the ground. It also enables them, and this is the second reason why this is important, it also enables them to bolster the transition to Afghan security forces. One of the kind of critical gaps that the Afghan security forces now, which are up over 300,000 troops, one of the critical gaps that they have is in supporting forces, in logistics, in helicopters, and all those kind of enablers that US forces are still able to provide. So that's another reason why the US military is quite keen to remain on in bigger numbers through 2013. The third reason is even moving 66,000 troops is a big operation. It's relatively easy if you decide that everyone wants to pack up and go home and you leave all your equipment behind. But that's not what the US want to do. They want to take the bulk of their equipment with them, and that's quite a big logistical operation. It involves quite a lot of security to move these men and equipment out of the country. So if you have more troops through 2013, 2014, it enables you to do that, and at the same time have enough troops to continue supporting Afghan forces and continue carrying out some combat operations. Nevertheless, what it really boils down to, in my view, is whether a continued US military presence helps the situation in Afghanistan or hurts it. Now, quite clearly, in recent years, despite the US surge, after 2009 surge of military forces in Afghanistan, the security situation on the ground has deteriorated. But that was always anticipated when the surge occurred. What they were essentially doing was sending troops into areas where they hadn't been. They were always going to stir things up a little bit and always going to provoke reactions from the Taliban. But what it was intended to do was to make the Taliban more likely to and keener to come to the negotiating table. In other words, the US theory has been that if you increase the military pressure on the Taliban, you can fight them. You can essentially fight them to the negotiating table. In part, this is right. You do have to give the Taliban and other insurgent groups reason to come to the table. And if they are winning the war on the ground, they have no reason to. They just have to wait until you leave. The problem with this idea is that the way you fight may help the Taliban also win hearts and minds amongst Afghans, and that's what we've seen with the increasing number of civilian casualties and with some of the tactics that military forces have used in Afghanistan, particularly things like night raids. And more importantly, the military success or failure of the Taliban is only one element in their calculations about whether or not they will come to the negotiating table. Another critical element is the Taliban and other insurgent groups' perception of the legitimacy of the Afghan government. There's no reason for them to negotiate with an Afghan government to seek reconciliation or to engage in a reconciliation process if they think that government is going to fall as soon as NATO leaves. And this is where the other element of international engagement with Afghanistan comes in, and that's ISAF, US, NATO's economic and political engagement. This is why this is important. Like most wars, this one has produced its fair share of aphorisms. One of the most common you hear in Afghanistan is that NATO has watches, but the Taliban has time. The idea is that the idea behind that is fairly obvious. It's that all the Taliban have to do is to wait out the international commitment, not just the military commitment to Afghanistan, but the economic one as well. And what this harks back to is the kind of important historical point. The Najibullah regime during the Soviet period in Afghanistan collapsed not after the Soviets withdrew militarily, but after the Soviets withdrew their economic support, some 3 years after they pulled their troops out. Now, not every aphorism produces a policy response, but this one seems to have. So as NATO and the US announced, at the same time as they announced their military withdrawal from Afghanistan by 2014, at the Chicago summit this year, they announced a program of ongoing economic and political commitment to Afghanistan for a 10-year period beyond 2014. So the idea is, yes, we'll pull our troops out by 2014, but we'll stay engaged economically, in development terms, and politically in Afghanistan out to 2024. Now, the idea here is fairly obvious again, is that through economic and political support, you buttress the legitimacy of the Afghan central government. And in the case of the US, they've formalised this in the form of a strategic partnership agreement with Afghanistan. It's a clear message that the Taliban, if you think the government will fall, if you think government control of the Afghan state will fall into your laps once ISAF and the US pulls out militarily, then you're wrong. The only problem with this idea, however, is that I'm not so sure that the international community's commitment to Afghanistan really will last a decade beyond 2014. There are some practical reasons why I have my doubts. One is, and can be summed up in the line, how much money can you spend in Kabul? One of the important enablers, if you like, of some of the development effort, such as it has been in regional parts of Afghanistan and the provinces, has been our military presence there. Once we pull back that military presence, the ability of at least government donor agencies to operate outside the capital or operate outside secure zones is going to be much more limited. And if there are limited places where you can operate, there's also going to be a limit on what you can spend your money on. But there's a bigger question here for me, and that relates to whether the international community will really have its heart in this commitment for 10 years once our troops have gone. One of the clear things that's happened in Afghanistan is the way that most Western countries, including Australia, have instrumentalised their aid to the country. In other words, we've used it in the service of our military presence rather than as an end in itself. You know, the idea is our troops go in, we use our aid and development effort to buttress our military effort to help our troops win hearts and minds. In effect, through these ongoing commitments, we are now instrumentalising that aid once again to get our troops out. We're saying, okay, we're going to pull our troops out in 2014, but look, we're still committed to the country, we'll still continue to spend money on it for 10 years afterwards. The problem with that is once troops are out, people are going to start asking themselves in Western capitals, you know, why Afghanistan deserves so much largesse. I mean, the Australian case is a great example of this. Not many people would be aware that Afghanistan today has become our fourth largest recipient of international aid. And I simply don't see that, certainly that aid commitment lasting once our troops are gone. So the question then is, will the Taliban come to the negotiating table before our attention span for Afghanistan ends? I suspect they won't. But there's a bigger question here, and that's the purpose of our engagement. Typically, our commitment in Afghanistan is portrayed or seen in terms of winning and losing. I think it's the wrong. It's been the wrong paradigm, and it's a paradigm that governments themselves have used. What our military presence in Afghanistan has really been about, not just our military presence, but our developmental commitment, our political commitment, our economic commitment to the country. What it's really been about has been about keeping the country afloat, keeping the kind of government we've installed there afloat, enabling them to tread water to a point where they can swim. Yes, there have been some advances. You know, we've helped change some things on the ground, and there have been some important advances in things like healthcare and women's education. But the reality is what we've been doing is holding the place together, hoping that the locals will eventually, and it can only come from the locals, this kind of political transformation and development, despite what some of our military philosophers say, you cannot drop governments from a box from the sky. This thing does have to happen indigenously. The hope was that while we remain there, this would grow of its own accord. Now, that kind of treading water role is not a particularly glamorous role for the military, but it can be an effective one. The problem now is that the question you have to ask yourself is, we've been there now a little over a decade, and have we reached the point where once we withdraw, the Afghans will be able to swim on their own? And again, I think there are some serious doubts. And the problem here is not that the moment we withdraw our military, the moment we withdraw our economic support, or the moment it starts to decline, the Taliban will march into Kabul and take over. In fact, a more likely scenario, in my view, is that the country will once again descend into a civil war. Now that will be tragic for all kinds of realpolitik reasons, but most importantly, it will be tragic for the Afghans themselves. And what this all boils down to, in terms of our engagement in the country, and people will still talk about, well, what is it we're doing there? What is it? What are our objectives? And I'm not quite sure what they are anymore, but it's quite clear that our objective today in Afghanistan has become to get out. This brings me to the domestic context. So what will happen in Afghanistan on the ground politically that will shape the role that Afghanistan will play in its region, will shape the dynamics in the region beyond 2014 into 2015. Here, I'll make a couple of observations. First, a lot of what I've said about the shape of our international engagement in Afghanistan, the shape of the US and NATO's international engagement in Afghanistan, will obviously have a major impact on the domestic political situation. In particular, on the functioning and the legitimacy of the Afghan state. This obviously relates to everything from the internal security situation and stability within the country, to the ability of the country to secure its borders, to the corruption within the state, to the efficiency and the efficiency of state delivery, to the state of the economy more generally. And the key event here in terms of the political evolution of Afghanistan is the presidential election in 2014. And whether we can help make that election in 2014 legitimate and recognise it as legitimate will be critical to the legitimacy of the central government, and in turn its ability to reach a political settlement with the insurgents. Crudely, if the election is credible, the winner is seen as legitimate, it strengthens the prospects for negotiation and reconciliation. If it's not credible, then the Taliban can go on waiting for the government to fall. Now, military engagement is important because it will determine the security context of that election. It'll determine where voting can take place. And therefore, again, the shape of our military commitment through to 2014 and beyond will have an enormous impact on the domestic political situation. But it's also about economic and political engagement. If there's no, again, our ability to support the state, our ability to support state delivery, to buttress its legitimacy, will play a critical role in whether what we move towards is either a political settlement, some form of political reconciliation of the various factions in Afghanistan, or towards a civil war. But there is a second element here, and that's independent of what the West or what kind of international community does in Afghanistan, and that's obviously what the Afghans themselves do. There are questions about the state and the quality of the Afghan national security forces. And even if, as a recent Asia Foundation poll found, the confidence of Afghans in their army is quite high, there are clearly still problems with the size, the effectiveness, and the leadership of the military. And as I said, even if we leave this to one side, and even if these things were not problematic, which many of them are, the international military drawdown will leave major gaps in terms of the critical enablers for Afghan forces, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, in helicopters and logistics. There are also quite clearly continuing to be issues surrounding corruption, the efficiency of government services that are independent of what we do on the ground. And there is not, it doesn't seem to me at least, a lot of prospect that much will change between now and 2014. There are procedural, technical, and as I said earlier, security questions surrounding the election, and the recent ICG report on that is a great example of which highlighted some of the critical issues that need to be addressed between now and 2014 for there to be an effective election, and I commend the report to you if you wanted to go into more of the detail. And what that basically means is, like our military and our economic and our political engagement going into 2014, the outlook for the domestic political situation going into that period is not a particularly good one. This brings me finally to regional and international relationships. There are a number of these that surround Afghanistan, and I won't go through all of them, but there are a number that are clearly important. First, there's obviously India and Pakistan. This is obviously critical because Pakistan and India have played out and continue to play out their rivalry and competition and conflicts in Afghanistan. India clearly doesn't want to see a return of the Taliban regime or a return of anything that will play host to extremist movements, and Pakistan does not want to see India meddling in its backyard. And generally, in terms of the India-Pakistan relationship, despite some promising moves, the relationship is still one more characterised by enmity and suspicion rather than amity. There are clearly opportunities there for Pakistan in terms of developing the relationship with India, but the challenges in security terms remain as well. And for a military in Pakistan that's still very largely predicated on the rivalry and the threat from India, it will be difficult to see them kind of changing tack by 2014 or beyond. In fact, the idea that Afghanistan will be increasingly up for grabs will increase rather than decrease the suspicion between these two countries. There was an idea at the beginning of the first Obama administration to seek some improvement in India-Pakistan relations as a part of a broader effort to improve the situation in Afghanistan, but unfortunately that idea was too quickly thrown into the too hard basket, and we may pay for that as we head for 2014. The second critical relationship is the US-Pakistan relationship. In many ways, the US-Pakistan relationship is the most difficult that either has had to manage. Both countries are brought together largely by pragmatic interests rather than any genuine sense of partnership. It's partly for this reason the relationship has frayed over the course of US involvement in Afghanistan. But the irony here is that Afghanistan has also held the relationship together as much as it has caused it to decline. It has meant, for example, that US exasperation with a range of Pakistani policies has been tempered by an American need for Pakistan on a practical level, right down to issues like the resupply of its troops in Afghanistan. Likewise, for Pakistan, the reality of the American military presence in Afghanistan has meant that an uneasy amity rather than open enmity serves its interests in a country that it sees very much as part of its sphere of influence. In that sense, as we approach 2014 and beyond, and the reality and the sense grows that America is leaving Afghanistan in a whole range of ways, this may prove to be oddly liberating for the US-Pakistan relationship, but liberating not in a good way. That is, they may actually be a lot freer to oppose and less inclined to cooperate with each other. The Iran-US relationship figures here too. Now the future of that relationship is a lot more in the air, I believe. I believe that Obama will make another attempt at a diplomatic settlement with Iran over its nuclear issue early in the term of his new administration. If that effort succeeds, it could have a very positive impact in terms of cooperation in Afghanistan, as we saw at the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, when Iran and the US were able to kind of manufacture a reasonable level of cooperation in that country because their interests aligned. Nevertheless, if the Iran-US relationship does head down the path of conflict, and there's a 50-50 chance of that happening, then this could become even more destabilising in Afghanistan, where Iran has shown already that it's prepared to use support for insurgent groups as a point of pressure on the US. Even in some cases, insurgent groups that it has opposed in the past. Finally, I also wanted to throw in China. And here I'm talking about China's relations with the US, but also with India and Pakistan. In many respects, these are some of the most interesting regional and international relationships, but also the most complex set. China, I think, has been a little caught on Afghanistan. On the one hand, it's resisted getting involved in a mission that runs contrary to the general principle that it follows in international relations of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. Nevertheless, it's also been very worried about what it means to have US bases in Central Asia that ostensibly support the US mission in Afghanistan, but which to Chinese eyes look a lot like an attempt to encircle them. On the other hand, however, China does worry about instability and extremist movements spreading from Afghanistan through Central Asia into Western China. So far, its engagement on Afghanistan has largely been economic and to a lesser degree political. But as the West pulls out, this may change. It will certainly complicate China's regional relationships. Ironically, China may have a lot more in common with its regional rival India on Afghanistan than it will have with its current regional ally Pakistan, at least in terms of seeing a stable government and no extremist groups operating out of Afghanistan. But at the same time, any Chinese presence in Afghanistan or any effort by China to establish a greater presence in that country will also set off strategic alarm bells in India. So where does all that, where do these three contexts leave us beyond 2014? This is where I want to finish. So what basically is what I've been saying. We see a military drawdown, and I also think realistically a drawdown in the West's political and economic engagement in Afghanistan, not much beyond 2014. I see a security situation that will get worse. I see a state in Afghanistan whose legitimacy will continue to erode. I see regional rivalries that are unlikely to improve and will still be there in 2014. What will that mean? There are a couple of ways of looking at it. One way of looking at the situation post-2014 is in terms of the original intention that the US and its allies had for going into Afghanistan, and in many ways the continuing justification. That's in terms of terrorism. I mean, when Obama talked about when Obama made the decision to surge troops into Afghanistan in 2009, he talked about two discrete objectives. He said, we want to destroy Al-Qaeda, but we also want to ensure that Afghanistan will never again serve as a safe haven for terrorist groups. Now, on the first count, you can say more or less that objective has been achieved. You can quibble about what it actually means, but you know, Osama bin Laden is dead. Al-Qaeda's kind of main body, if you like, has been scattered, and it's clearly a much less effective organisation than it used to be. But in terms of the second objective, the question really is, how long is a piece of string? I mean, at what point do you say that Afghanistan is going to stop potentially being a safe haven for extremist groups? Given that not only have we seen in Afghanistan, in some senses, the successes of the West's counter-terrorism effort with the breakup of Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups, but on the other side of the ledger, we've seen new extremist groups move into spaces vacated by them, including Pakistani groups. And we've also seen the radicalisation of groups, including younger members of the Taliban, who were not interested in international terrorism in the past. And there's another element to this. Without announcing it officially, it's clear that the Obama administration has settled on a counter-terrorism strategy in Afghanistan and beyond that's going to be very heavily dependent on drones. Now, that's a now, pursuing that kind of possibility has its advantages and it has its disadvantages. One of the main disadvantages is that it places strains on the diplomatic relations you have with allies in the region, as it has clearly in the case of Pakistan. And in some senses, at some point, I think they're going to reach a point of diminishing returns. There are other disadvantages. If all you're going to do is circle your drones around countries and shoot extremists and oftentimes civilians, what it doesn't do is give you much of a feel for what's actually happening in the country. You become disconnected with the reality on the ground. The other point I'd make on extremism is the threat that the US and its Western allies faced in 9/11, on 9/11, didn't emerge a week before 9/11. It didn't even emerge a year before 9/11. You can trace the roots of Al-Qaeda back 10, 15, 20 years. In other words, there are dynamics at play now. There are forces that have been set in motion now that may well result in new extremist threats in 10 or 15 years' time, ones that we can't even imagine. And to put that in a broader context, if you look at the Arab uprisings, I remain a medium-term optimist about the transformations in the Arab world, but a short-term pessimist. There are a lot of good things that will come out of the Arab uprising in terms of the democratization of the Arab world, but there will also be some nasty things that will come out in the short term. Interior ministries have diminished capabilities. States have less control over their territory. Where once, before 9/11, if you're talking about that broad West Asian region, to put it in the way we kind of characterize it at the Law Institute, if you were talking about potential safe havens or ungoverned spaces for extremism, before 9/11, you were basically talking about Afghanistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, maybe parts of Yemen. Today, as a result of the Arab uprisings, you're talking about Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, parts of Syria, parts of Lebanon, Libya, Mali, Sinai. The number of these spaces in which new groups can operate have multiplied, and that has to be seen. Afghanistan's future needs to be seen in that broader regional context as well. But I also think we tend to look at this thing too narrowly. By focusing narrowly on the terrorism dimension, we've lost perspective on the broader regional dimension. Afghanistan sits in the midst of a region that has 2 nuclear powers and probably one on the way. It sits at the nexus of extremist groups, of drug trafficking, of other criminal activity. It sits astride some of the most important sea lanes and land-based lines of communication in the world. And yet, our effort to deal with it as a regional security problem has remained, despite our 10 years in Afghanistan, very, very limited. We tend to think of regional dynamics in South Asia in terms of what impact they'll have on Afghanistan, rather than the role that the dynamics in Afghanistan play in the region. And Afghanistan, in that sense, plays the role that it's always played historically in the region as a space where regional rivalries continue to be played out. There are lots of reasons why it's important to stabilise the situation in Afghanistan, not least because I think we owe it to the Afghan people. But if you're looking purely in realpolitik reasons, Afghanistan's ability to control what happens in its territory, to not be subject to civil war, to control its borders, also has an important part to play in broader regional dynamics. The ability, Afghanistan is not the reason why India and Pakistan get on. And solving Afghanistan won't solve the conflict between India and Pakistan. But Afghanistan as a place where people can, where regional countries can, through their proxies, fight proxy wars, will contribute to suspicions between those 2 countries, and in fact has over the last 10 years. There are other dimensions to this, and I'm happy to talk about in the question time. I want to end on the point that these days, when you talk about Afghanistan, we seem to actually. Before I come to that point, one thing I do want to stress. What I'm not saying here is that what's required here is a continued Western military commitment in Afghanistan. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be pulling our troops out by 2014. There are whole sets of issues around the effectiveness of what we've done militarily on the ground. What I am saying is we have to change our mindset about Afghanistan. We have to stop thinking about Afghanistan purely in terms of counter-terrorism and start thinking about it in terms of regional security dynamics of an important and unstable part of the world. And today, when we seem to struggle to be able to find reasons to engage in Afghanistan, in future the problem might not be finding reasons to stay, but the fact that we'll find lots of reasons to regret leaving. Thank you.